Hi class. We are on to our kind of third week of instruction in this class. And in this third week of instruction, I think it's the fourth week overall, we're really going to start dialing into education psychology, not just developmental psychology and not just cognitive psychology. We're obviously still underneath those branches, but a really, really big thing is today we're going to start talking about Lev Vygotsky, who I think is probably the biggest contributor to education psychology as a field and as the creation of that discipline, rather than just looking at developmental psychology, which is what we were really focused on with Piaget and Erikson in the last 2 weeks. Now, the way I want to go about this is kind of the same note-taking format where I'll fill this note sheet out. I've got this note sheet in a completed form over on this left computer that you can't see. I'll be filling it out as we go so that you can take notes if you would like. This note page will have some fill in the blanks for you. But boy, this is going to be a big one. I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to finish in time. This video might end up being 2 videos. It might end up being an hour. And, technically speaking, this is 3 in-class hours a week of course time. So my guess is, this one might be a little bit longer. There might be a little bit more content to take in. And then the quiz is going to be, it's actually going to be 4 response questions. I'm going to ask you 4 questions that you have to write a paragraph in response to. So, but I really think we got to get Vygotsky down. So this week's going to just be a little bit more involved, maybe. I don't want to make it like so difficult that all weekend long you're just scrambling to do your Vygotsky study. But I really think this stuff's so important. And when we start talking about major effects in education at the very end of this video, this last heading, I think you'll see that Vygotsky's work created a framework for thinking about education that is so persistent even today. And I think you'll see that when we get to this major effects on education. So, but let's get into it. I don't need to keep belaboring this introduction. Also, I'm sorry my face is dark. I don't have the lights on. When I noticed that when I have the lights on with this camera, there's like a shimmer that goes down the screen cam. It just looks really weird, and it kind of hurts my eyes. So I decided to just turn the lights off. So sorry about that. I know my face is very dark in this video, but okay. So Lev Vygotsky, this guy, like I said, huge impact on the field of education psychology. As with the other 3 guys, or the other 2 guys we've studied, which are Erikson and Piaget, Lev Vygotsky also began his main bulk of work in the early 1900s. He was born in 1896 in Belarus. Oh, I just realized this is bold. We don't need that to be bold. He was born in Belarus. Now, Belarus at that time was Belarus, but it did eventually get sucked into the USSR. So eventually, Belarus just became a part of the USSR. And this is a very important fact. So USSR, I'm just going to call it the Soviet Union. This is so important. So he was born in 1896 in Belarus. Belarus got absorbed into the USSR, and therefore the culture and I guess the environment that Vygotsky grew up in was largely influenced by a guy that you probably will recognize this name. If you're not sure who this guy is, just know that this is kind of the father of communism, Karl Marx. Okay, Karl Marx is not a communist per se. He was a philosopher, and he was the first philosopher well, maybe not the first. I shouldn't. That's too strong of a term. But he was one of the main philosophers that really began to look on the fact that humans are how they are through socialization. Okay, he was obviously a what we'd call a socialist, or a communist by philosophical means, even though that invention of government was just coming about in these early 1900s period. At least what we would call modern communism. So Karl Marx, big time philosopher, saying that people are how they are because social influence. It's not necessarily cognitive development that makes you how you are. It's not necessarily religious development that makes you how you are. It's not necessarily um, a moral influence that makes you how you are. It is your social atmosphere. We are influenced by the people we're around, by our parents, by our teachers, by our friends, more heavily than anything else. That's the main influence. In fact, any other influence can largely be drawn from them. Okay, so that's kind of the background idea. So this lends itself to this leads to Vygotsky having a strong consideration for socialization in his ideas and thoughts. Okay, he had a very and we're going to talk about that in main ideas. We're going to get into that in just a moment. Okay, so but the fact that that's the environment he's growing up in was huge, and we don't actually, when I typed in and I was doing some research for this, and I like to look at both sides, and one of the main things that I wanted to look at was Vygotsky's theories too influenced by Marx in a way. That, to me, that's almost a sticking point. There might be almost too much socialization happening here. But the other sub note I want to make here real quick on this topic is that because Vygotsky had such a strong consideration for socialization being how people developed, he was very Piaget, who we studied last week, he disagreed with. Okay, this led to disagreement. Now, Piaget's work was not really popularized till the 1960s, even though Piaget came up with them at the same time as Vygotsky, roughly. So there wasn't like an active disagreement between them. This isn't Aldous Huxley and George Orwell type of conversation where they're actually getting into it. No, but he would have had a disagreement with Piaget, who thought that cognitive development was done through stages, okay, and was done naturally, right? It just happened over time. The word naturally is the key word here because, of course, as I've mentioned many times now, Vygotsky said it's not actually natural, it's socially. It's not done just because the brain develops this way. It develops this way because of social influences, okay? So so that's kind of our main things. The last thing I want to note in this background information is that he actually died in 1937 from tuberculosis, and super young. Like this guy was 41 years old when he died, and it was, 1934 when he died. So he wasn't even 40 years old yet, and yet he did become probably the most influential education psychologist of all time. So yeah, this is a big deal. If he had been around for longer, I'm really curious what kind of things would come out of him. So as I've already mentioned, we're going to get into the main ideas now. The main idea is called sociocultural theory of cognitive development. Okay, the big overarching thing that we are looking at when we study Vygotsky is that learning is social and cultural. Socio-cultural. Okay, so in other words, the social part is saying learning happens at any age because of other people. Okay, that's the socio part. Learning happens because of other people. Now, that's probably why Vygotsky is such a huge figure in education, because teachers love to hear that learning happens from them. If we just stuck with the Piagetian theories, learning would happen apart from us. Learning would happen in those incremental stages, and kids would ideally, just through a manner of play and hands-on learning and a matter of interaction with toys and content, they would be able to learn quite a bit without us. And Vygotsky's like, no, 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 no. Very little learning happens apart from other people. Okay, learning happens in part. I should say the majority here. The majority of learning happens because of other people. And then the cultural part is the type of learning that happens is influenced by the culture and upbringing and the essentially the identity of the people that you are interacting with. So these people's identities that you are learning from is going to shape the type of education you receive. The type of learning that happens is essentially fashioned and molded by the people who are the main influences. Okay, so you can even see this in Vygotsky's own life. He was influenced by the Marxist regime and the communist, I guess, the communist way of thinking, that the USSR, the Bolshevik Revolution, and those historical events had a massive impact on Vygotsky and how he viewed the world. And you can see that maybe that's part of his foundation for his theory, was that he experienced it. Here's another example of this is, let's just say that in in the United States, we are a multicultural society. And if you're in multicultural ed, that's kind of some of the things we're talking about right now. We're a multicultural society. And if you were to attend a private, let's just go with a private Christian school, and the main influences in your life are consistently teaching you a certain morality that is from the Christian perspective, and that is shaping the culture in which you're growing, and those people are the main influences in your life. But Vygotsky would say the odds really are that you will be fashioned in that mold, and you will become a thinker in that Christian culture and community. That's what Vygotsky would say. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean always. It doesn't necessarily mean 100% of the time. It just means the odds are that you will be fashioned and molded by that culture. In the exact same way, someone who grows up in, let's just say, North Korea, where they are being taught and fashioned by this North Korean hyper-communist, hyper-dictatorial way of thinking, where Kim Jong-un is God, that is going to affect how people think and affect the way they view the world and affect the way they view education. Right? And I think we see that. I think we see those two examples actually happening. I'm not just being theoretical. There is a reason why someone in a place of power can influence and lead a nation to continue thinking their way through the education system. I mean, I guess I'm getting skeptical here, but that's why I think this is so important to talk about. That's why Hitler Youth existed. And I mean, I'm not trying to be an alarmist here, but if you want to change the culture of a society, and if you want to control the culture, you control the education. So there's a lot of historical proof that the social cultural theory of cognitive development is true. Now, it's just a theory. There are obviously exceptions to the rule. There are people who will be raised in a certain cultural a cultural frame that do not fit the mold and rebel or go against the mold, whether that's people in North Korea or that's people in a Christian high school, right? So this is big stuff. We're getting into the idea that education and society are linked, and what goes into the education system leads to a certain type of society. That would not be true in a strict Piagetian sense. A strict Piagetian sense is that the development, education, and the culture are somewhat separate. Not entirely separate, but more separate than what Vygotsky is proposing here. Okay, so that's sociocultural theory of cognitive development. This obviously is linked to some other theories, because we're talking huge picture right now. One of the other big main ideas that comes from the social culture theory of cognitive development is what is called the cultural historical activity theory. Okay, cultural historical activity theory. This is also another huge big way of thinking, and it's a theoretical framework, really, more than anything, that helps us understand the relationship between our brains and what we think and what we feel and what people do, and how that is influenced by history. Okay, so the cultural historical activity theory, let me just give you the definition here. A theoretical framework in which a person's cognitive development is linked to social activity and history. Okay? Framework in which a person's, let me get those typos fixed. A person's cognitive development is linked to social activity and history. Okay, so for example, we're not just talking about the present culture anymore, but the historical culture. I earlier used the example of someone attending a Christian school and therefore having a Christian perspective on the world after high school, or someone going through the North Korean school system and having this authoritarianism and communist ideas about the world. Those ideas, because they are shaped over and over and over and over, become woven into the fabric of the society, both historically and presently. Okay, so if the odds recurrently are that a Christian school produces a person who believes in Christian things and therefore produces others who think that way, or a North Korean society produces North Koreans who think a certain way, we're going to get it again and again and again and again. It is obviously this is also a Marxist way of thinking, but we see it in the world. So it's obviously there's always outliers that don't fit the mold, but it is probably something that I think is most likely real. We call it a theory, but there's a huge amount of evidence to shape that the history of a place shapes the culture of the place, and that culture repeatedly recreates itself. So as we're getting into this way of thinking when it comes to education, the main thing here to know is that when it comes to students' educational goals and students' educational ability, there is a historical element for teachers to be aware of. And this is why we often talk about things in a systemic sense, right? When we look at statistics of certain demographics or certain cultures struggling academically or struggling with workforce readiness or whatever it may be, we are applying a certain cultural standard to a different culture, and then we're saying that culture is not meeting this standard, and it's essentially saying that this system does not fit with this culture. And that is why currently there's a push for affirmative action when it comes to some of the more systemic issues, such as systemic racism or systemic oppression of marginalized peoples. Okay, so that's where we're going with all this. I need to make that note so for your note page. This means that history reshapes itself iteratively and is most likely to recur. Okay, recur. Because of that, in education, things like cultural background and systemic oppression matter. Man, I've just boiled that down so much. There's a lot there. There's a ton to think about there. Like I said, this video is probably going to be long. So these are the main ideas that Vygotsky had. Learning is social, and because it's social, it reconstructs itself. And because it reconstructs itself, it is difficult to change how people think. Now, how does this actually happen? How does a culture reshape itself? How do people shape each other? What type of cultural values are communicated and repeated? Let's take the main idea and now let's put it into some usable terms. One of the terms that is always associated with Vygotsky, and he was the one who developed this term, and I use it even myself in education, is the zone of proximal development, the ZPD. Okay, the ZPD. You watched a video on the ZPT ideally before this video, so I'm not going to rehash out the ZPD entirely, but it is the theory that learning takes place because it's social, like learning takes place in a zone between what students know on their own and what they don't know but could know with help. Okay? It's that simple. It's the idea that learning occurs when a student is getting help from an outside source, from a social influence. Students learn when that social influence is helping them understand something that they couldn't understand on their own. Okay? If they already know it, it's not learning. And if it's something they can't learn on their own and there's no help, they will never get it. Okay? So you'll often see these 3 rings. And those 3 rings represent what kids know already, what kids could know with help, and what kids don't know. And you see the zone of proximal development is that middle ring. It's the idea that with help kids can learn. Okay? So the ZPD is the major thought here. And in schools, we apply this to things like math, science, English, ELA, say, reading, right, which is part of ELA, but I'm just going to put it. We apply it to things like social studies all the time. And here's what it means is, hey, if you've got a 7th grader that doesn't know their basic addition and subtraction, you can't teach them multiplication. Start with addition and subtraction. Even though they're in 7th grade, they should be able to get it. You can't. You have to start with what they don't know, and you have to help them. Okay? So that's the ZPD. And there's a video you already watched on it. I'm not going to completely rehash it out. The term, later a guy named Jerome Bruner, he is both a critic and contributor that we'll talk about in a moment, but Jerome Bruner said that the process of a teacher directly helping a student to understand a concept that the student could not understand on their own is called scaffolding. And you hear this in education all of the time. This might be the most popular term in education from the field of education psychology. Scaffolding. Probably the most common term. Scaffolding. What are you going to do to scaffold your students? If you have a group of students and in general, these students are struggling with this concept, but they understand the concept before it, how are you going to scaffold them? How are you going to help them get there? It's used all of the time, okay? And I'm going to, I just want to jump into the major effects that the ZPD and scaffolding have had on education. But let's just, I'm going to put that on pause for just a moment. In fact, I'm going to put this whole video on pause. This is part 1. I need you to watch part 2 now because I just know I'm about to run out of time on my recording program. So I'm going to click the stop button and then you can go